I treated a sick alien, and he revealed what Thry Atlas is really hiding. I never believed in fate until the night a dying stranger fell at my clinic door and whispered words that shattered everything. Nights are filled with fever checks, stitching wounds from bar fights, and signing prescriptions for insomnia that mirrors my own. My life had become a rhythm of fluorescent lights and the hum of outdated equipment, a quiet existence where I'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be truly awake. But that night, as autumn rain drummed against the windows and the clock ticked past midnight, I heard a sound that didn't belong to this world, a low, resonant thud against the glass door, like something heavy collapsing under its own impossible weight. I looked up from my paperwork to see a figure crumpled on the wet pavement outside, barely visible through the streaked glass and the glow of the street lamp. My first instinct was exhaustion, the weary thought that someone had overdosed or been in a fight. But when I rushed outside and knelt beside him, my breath caught in my throat. His clothes were strange, seamless and dark like woven shadow, and his skin was pale in a way that seemed to drink in the light rather than reflect it. But it was his eyes that stopped me, pale silver, dilated wide with pain, staring up at me with an intelligence so profound it felt like being seen for the first time in my entire life. I dragged him inside with strength I didn't know I had, my hands trembling as I locked the door and pulled the blinds shut with an urgency I couldn't explain. Something deep within me understood that this moment needed to be hidden, that what I was about to witness was not meant for the world to see. Not yet. I laid him on the examination table under the harsh white lights, and that's when I saw the wounds. 3 deep gashes across his abdomen, perfectly symmetrical, edges too clean to be from any blade I recognized, and from them seeped a substance that made my medical training feel like childhood fantasy. It was blood, yes, but under the examination light it glowed with a faint luminescence, a soft blue radiance that pulsed in rhythm with his labored breathing. I stood frozen, my gloved hands hovering over his body, my mind racing through every rational explanation and finding none that could hold. He reached up suddenly and gripped my wrist with surprising strength, and when his fingers touched my skin, even through the latex, I felt a warmth spread through me. Not physical heat, but something deeper, like recognition, like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. His lips moved, forming words in a voice that seemed to resonate in my chest rather than my ears, and he said, "You feel different. Your frequency. It's why I came to you." I should have called for help, should have documented everything, should have followed every protocol I'd been trained to follow, but instead I found myself moving on instinct, cleaning his wounds with hands that had steadied into an almost sacred focus. He watched me work with those luminous eyes, and I could feel the weight of his gaze, the way it seemed to see not just my face, but something deeper, the architecture of my soul, the hidden chambers of my heart, where I'd locked away every doubt and unanswered prayer. As I sutured the strange tissue that felt both organic and somehow crystalline under my fingers, he began to speak in a language I shouldn't have understood, but somehow did, words that bypassed my ears entirely and bloomed directly into understanding within my mind. He told me his name was something my tongue couldn't form, a sound like distant starlight, and that he was not from this world, not in the way I'd ever imagined when staring up at the night sky with childhood wonder. He was a scout, he said, a watcher from a civilization that had been monitoring Earth since before our recorded history began, and he was dying far from home because he'd broken protocol to reach someone like me. Your soul. Frequency, he whispered again, his voice growing weaker. It matches the old pattern, the original design. That's why you've always felt like you don't quite belong here. And in that moment, surrounded by the clinical smell of antiseptic and the otherworldly glow of his blood on my instruments, I felt the first crack in the wall I'd built between faith and reality. The rain continued outside, but inside that small clinic, time seemed to slow and thicken like honey, each second stretching into an eternity as I worked to save the life of a being I couldn't explain. He drifted in and out of consciousness, and each time his eyes opened, they held a desperate urgency, as though he was running out of time not just to live, but to deliver a message that the universe itself had entrusted to him. I found myself praying as I worked, not the rote prayers of Sunday obligation, but raw, honest pleas to a God I'd almost stopped believing was listening, asking for guidance, for wisdom, for the strength to face whatever truth was about to be revealed. And as I pressed gauze against wounds that glowed with impossible light, as I felt his alien heart struggling beneath my palms with a rhythm that was almost but not quite human, I understood with sudden, terrifying clarity that my life had just divided into before and after. Before this moment, I was a woman going through motions, practicing medicine in a world that made sense, where science and faith occupied separate, tidy boxes. After this moment, I would be something else entirely, a witness, a keeper of secrets, someone who had touched the hem of a mystery so vast it made the observable universe seem small. He gripped my hand again, his strength fading, and whispered, "I need to show you something before I die. Something about what's coming, something about Three-Eye Atlas." And though I had no idea what those words meant, I felt them settle into my bones like a prophecy, like a name that had been waiting my entire life to be spoken. I pulled a chair close to the examination table, my legs suddenly unable to hold me, as the weight of his words sank deeper than reason. His breathing had stabilized slightly under my care, but I could see the life dimming behind those silver eyes like stars fading at dawn. When I asked him what he meant by frequency, by original design, his hand moved weakly to his chest and pressed against a place where the strange fabric of his garment seemed to pulse with inner light. He told me that every living soul emits a signature, a vibrational pattern as unique as a fingerprint, but infinitely more revealing, and that most humans on Earth had been altered, he said, their frequencies dampened by generations of fear, control, and forgetting. But some, like me, had somehow retained the original harmonic, the one that was encoded into humanity at the very beginning, when we were more than flesh, when we were still remember that we were children of something vast and loving. I felt tears burning behind my eyes, though I couldn't explain why, as if some part of me that had been silent my entire life was suddenly hearing its own name called across an impossible distance. He continued, his voice growing softer but more urgent, telling me that his people had been watching Earth not as conquerors or gods, but as gardeners, as witnesses to an experiment so sacred that entire civilizations across the galaxies had devoted themselves to its success. And I was crying now, openly, because something in his words resonated with every prayer I'd ever whispered into the darkness, every moment I'd stood under the stars and felt utterly alone, yet somehow held. He struggled to sit up slightly, and I supported him, my hand still stained with the luminous blue of his blood, and he reached toward a band on his wrist that I'd assumed was injury-related, but now recognized as technology beyond anything I'd seen. With a gesture that seemed to cost him immense effort, he activated something, and suddenly the air above us shimmered and tore open like a curtain being pulled aside to reveal a window into impossible truth. There, hovering in three-dimensional light between us, was a holographic projection so detailed and beautiful it took my breath away. Our solar system rendered in perfect miniature, each planet suspended in its orbital dance, the sun a golden point of radiance at the center. But there was something else, something marked with symbols I couldn't read, but somehow understood, carried warning and promise in equal measure. He directed my attention with a trembling finger to an object moving through the outer reaches. Something my eyes initially dismissed as just another comet or asteroid, one of the countless pieces of cosmic debris that drift through the void. But the label beside it made my heart stop. Three-Eye/Atlas, he pronounced it, carefully, and said that what our astronomers had catalogued as a simple interstellar comet was actually something that would change everything we believed about our origins, about God, about why we were here at all. The hologram zoomed in, and I saw it clearly now. Not a random ice ball tumbling through space, but something with structure, with purpose, with a geometry that spoke of intelligent design. My hands gripped the edge of the table as he explained, his words coming faster now, as if he knew his time was running out, and the message was more important than his final breaths. He told me that 3I/Atlas was not a natural object, but an ark, ancient beyond human. Comprehension, sent to Earth billions of years ago by beings he called the architects, entities of such evolved consciousness that they existed at the threshold between physical and divine, servants of the same creative force that every human faith had tried to name and understand. These architects, he said, did not create randomly, but with profound love and intention, seeding worlds with the potential for consciousness, for souls that could grow and learn and eventually return to unity with the infinite source. Earth was one such garden, he whispered, and 3I/Atlas had carried here the original templates, the divine blueprints encoded not just in DNA, but in something deeper, the spiritual genetics that made us capable of love, of sacrifice, of recognizing God in a sunset or a stranger's kindness. I thought of every sermon I'd heard about creation, every scientific explanation for human evolution, and realized he was offering something that didn't contradict either, but wove them together into a tapestry so beautiful and complex that my mind could barely hold it. He looked at me with such intensity then, and said that the ark had been dormant, waiting, but now it was waking up, responding to a signal that humanity itself was sending out through our collective consciousness, our readiness, or perhaps our desperate need, to remember who we really were. The hologram flickered, and he winced in pain, and I reached for him instinctively, holding his shoulder as a doctor, as a human, as someone who suddenly understood that this dying being had traveled unimaginable distances to deliver hope to a world drowning in despair. He told me that his people had been monitoring 3I/Atlas for generations, watching as it made its slow journey through the cosmos, and that recent changes, trajectory shifts, energy emissions, awakening signatures, suggested that the time of revelation was approaching, perhaps within months, perhaps sooner. "Your governments know," he said, his voice barely a whisper now. "They've known for years, but they hide it because the truth would unravel every system of control they've built." I felt anger flash through me, but he squeezed my hand with surprising gentleness and continued, saying that the architects had planned for this, that the truth could not be suppressed forever, that divine love always finds a way to break through every wall we build. Against it. He told me I was part of that plan, that my different frequency had drawn him to my door, not by accident, but by an orchestration so subtle and perfect it could only be called grace. And as I sat there in my small-town clinic, holding the hand of a dying alien under fluorescent lights while a hologram of our solar system floated between, as I felt something I hadn't felt in years, the absolute certainty that God was real, was present, was working through means so strange and wonderful that all my doubts seemed small and foolish in comparison. I leaned closer to the hologram, my breath shallow, as he adjusted something on the device strapped to his wrist, and suddenly the image of 3I/Atlas expanded until it filled the space above us like a second sky, rotating slowly to reveal details that made my medical training feel utterly inadequate for what I was witnessing. The surface wasn't ice after all, or at least not only ice. There were patterns etched into it, vast geometric shapes that repeated and interlocked with mathematical precision, forming something that looked less like random cosmic debris and more like a cathedral designed by angels who understood the language God spoke when he divided light from darkness. He told me these weren't decorations, but encoded information, a library written in sacred geometry that contained the original instructions. For human consciousness, the divine frequencies that had been breathed into the first stirrings of life on our world. I watched the shapes pulse with faint light, and somewhere in my soul, I recognized them, the way you might recognize a lullaby your mother sang before you had words to remember it. "This is the seed," he whispered, his voice thick. With reverence despite his pain, this is what the architects sent across the void when Earth was still young, when your oceans were new and your continents had not yet found their final shapes. I thought of Genesis, of the Spirit moving over the waters, and realized I was looking at the same truth, told in a different language, seeing the fingerprints of God pressed into ice and starlight and intention that had traveled for ages just to reach us. He coughed then, a terrible sound that brought my medical instincts back to the surface. But when I moved to check his vital signs, he caught my wrist with surprising strength and pulled my attention back to the hologram, to a section of 3i/Atlas that was glowing brighter than the rest, pulsing with a rhythm that seemed almost biological, almost like a heartbeat. "It's waking," he said, and there was fear in his voice now, mixed with something that might have been joy or might have been grief. I couldn't tell. He explained that the Ark had remained dormant for billions of years, a seed waiting for the right season, but that something had changed in the past few decades. Something about humanity's collective consciousness had reached a threshold, a frequency of desperation and seeking and readiness that had triggered the awakening protocols built into 3i/Atlas by minds that understood timing on a divine scale. I asked him what would happen when it fully awakened, and he turned those silver eyes to me with such profound seriousness that I felt the question had weight beyond anything I'd intended. "It will broadcast," he said slowly, carefully, as if each word carried the fate of worlds. "It will send out a signal that resonates with the original human frequency, the one that was given to your ancestors when they were first kissed into consciousness by the architects." He paused, struggling for breath, then continued, telling me that anyone who still carried that frequency, anyone whose soul hadn't been completely dampened by generations of fear and control, would suddenly remember that they were more than animals struggling for survival, more than accidents of chemistry. Remember that they were beloved children of an infinite creative intelligence that some called God and others called the Source, but which was always, always rooted in love. My mind raced through the implications, through every patient I'd ever treated, every person in my small town, every human being on the planet suddenly confronted with a truth that could heal or shatter, depending on how ready they were to receive it. I asked him what the governments were afraid of, why they would hide something so beautiful, and his expression darkened in a way that made him look ancient despite his injuries. "Because the signal won't just awaken souls," he said quietly. "It will reveal truth in all forms. It will make lies impossible to sustain. It will show people exactly who has been serving love and who has been serving control, disguised as love." I felt a chill run through me as he explained that 3i/Atlas was designed not just as a gift but as a mirror, that its activation would create a transparency in human affairs that would expose every hidden agenda, every manipulation, every system built on keeping people small and afraid and separated from their divine nature. He told me that's why his people had been monitoring it so carefully, why he'd been sent to find someone with the original frequency who could be trusted with what was coming. Someone who might help humanity navigate the revelation without tearing itself apart in the process. I looked at the glowing hologram, at the mathematical perfection of those sacred patterns, and understood suddenly why every prophet and mystic throughout history had spoken of a day of unveiling, a moment when all that was hidden would be brought to light, not as punishment but as liberation, as the final gift from a God who loved his children too much to let them sleep forever in forgetfulness. He reached toward the hologram with a trembling hand, touching a section of 3I/Atlas that flared brighter at his gesture, and suddenly I was seeing not just the arc, but its trajectory, its path through our solar system mapped across months and years, showing how it had already passed through the outer boundaries and was now moving inexorably inward, toward Earth, toward us, toward a rendezvous that had been planned before human civilization, had built its first temple or whispered its first prayer. "When will it happen?" I asked, my voice barely steady, and he looked at me with eyes that held both sympathy and certainty. "Soon," he whispered. "The signal has already begun, faint and building, and within months it will reach strength enough that no one will be able to ignore it. That every observatory will detect it, that every sensitive soul will feel it in their dreams and their quiet moments." He told me that his mission had been to prepare the way, to find those who still carried the original frequency and help them understand what they were about to experience, so that when the moment came, they could stand as witnesses and guides rather than be swept away by the magnitude of remembering. I thought of every sermon about the second coming, every prophecy about stars falling and heavens opening, and realized I might be sitting at the threshold of their fulfillment, not as supernatural violence, but as the natural consequence of a love so patient it had waited billions of years to fully reveal itself, to finally call its children home to truth. I watched the hologram shimmer and fold in on itself until it showed something else entirely, not the ark anymore, but Earth itself, our blue marble suspended in the darkness, and I felt my heart clench with unexpected tenderness at how fragile and beautiful it looked from this perspective, how precious every ocean and continent appeared when seen as part of something larger than politics or borders, or the small concerns that filled my daily life. The alien's fingers moved across his wrist device again, and suddenly I was seeing layers peel back from the planet's surface, seeing through geological time. Like flipping through the pages of an ancient book written in stone and DNA and the patient architecture of evolution guided by hands, I was only beginning to understand. He spoke then with a voice that had grown softer but somehow more present, telling me that Earth had never been an accident, that the architects had chosen this world with the same care a gardener chooses soil for a rare and sacred seed, preparing the conditions across millions of years until everything was ready for consciousness to take root in a form that could eventually recognize its own divine nature. I saw oceans teeming with early life, saw the first creatures crawl onto land, saw the slow, magnificent unfolding of complexity that science called evolution, but which he described as intentional artistry, as God working through natural law rather than against it, painting with time and chemistry and the infinite patience of a love that measures success not in years, but in the perfection of souls ripened toward their purpose. The hologram shifted again, and now I was seeing something that made my medical understanding of human biology seem like a child's drawing compared to a master's canvas. I saw the double helix of DNA, but rendered in light that revealed hidden dimensions I'd never imagined, showing how our genetic code wasn't just information for building bodies, but contained frequencies, harmonic patterns that resonated with something beyond the physical, something that connected our flesh to the consciousness that moved through all creation like breath through a flute. He explained that the architects had woven these frequencies into the very seeds carried by 3I/Atlas, that when those seeds found purchase in Earth's primordial soup they brought with them, not just the potential for life, but the specific resonance that would allow biological creatures to eventually house souls capable of experiencing love, wonder, sacrifice, creativity, all the qualities that reflected the nature of the source itself, the God who desired not servants, but children, not automatons. but beings free enough to choose relationship with their creator. I thought of being made in God's image and realized I was seeing the mechanism behind that ancient truth, seeing how spirit and matter had been married from the very beginning, through frequencies embedded in our cells, through sacred geometry written into our bones and neurons, and the electrical songs our hearts sang with every beat. The alien touched my forehead gently, and suddenly I felt it. Felt the frequency humming in my own body, felt how my consciousness wasn't produced by my brain, but received by it, how I was both animal and angel, both dust and divinity, exactly as Scripture had always insisted, but in ways that made science and faith embrace rather than oppose each other. When he pulled his hand away, I was trembling, tears streaming down my face without my permission, overwhelmed by the recognition of what I'd always sensed, but never had words or proof to validate, that my existence meant something beyond survival, that every patient I'd ever treated carried this same sacred frequency whether they knew it or not, that the universe wasn't cold and random, but intentional and intimate and woven through with a love so fundamental it literally held atoms together, and taught birds their migration paths, and whispered to human hearts in the quiet moments when we stopped running long enough to listen. The alien's breathing had become more labored, but his eyes held mine with fierce gentleness as he told me the hardest part of the truth, the part that would challenge everything humanity had built its civilizations upon. He said that we were not the architect's first experiment and would not be their last, that across the galaxy there were thousands of worlds where consciousness had been planted and nurtured, each one a unique expression of the same divine impulse to create beings capable of love and choice and growth toward unity with the source. I felt my sense of human specialness waver and then reform into something larger and more beautiful, understanding suddenly that we weren't diminished by being one among many, but honored by being included in a family so vast it spanned galaxies, that God's love wasn't smaller for being shared, but revealed as infinitely more magnificent than our small theologies had dared to imagine. He told me that Earth's experiment had always been about learning to hold both individuality and unity, about evolving souls that could be fully themselves while recognizing their fundamental connection to all other souls, and that this was the divine pattern the architects served, not as gods themselves, but as gardeners working in the fields of an intelligence so vast and loving that even they could only glimpse its fullness through the beauty of what they helped bring into being. The hologram faded, and we were left in the dim light of my clinic, but everything looked different now, charged with meaning I couldn't have perceived an hour ago. The medical equipment that sustained life, the walls that sheltered vulnerability, the night beyond my windows that held countless stars, and perhaps countless other worlds wrestling with their own awakening to divine purpose, all of it suddenly connected in a web of intention that made my role as a healer feel like participation in something holy rather than merely practical. He reached into a fold of his strange clothing and withdrew an object that caught what little light remained in the room and transformed it into rainbows that danced across the ceiling like northern lights compressed into crystal, and he pressed it into my palm with fingers that had gone cold despite my best efforts to warm them, telling me that this device contained the full message meant for humanity when 3I/Atlas completed its awakening, a day message that would help people understand they were loved beyond measure, that they had never been alone or forgotten, that every prayer whispered in darkness had been heard by ears that stretched across dimensions, and that the answer was finally coming in a form the whole world would witness together. I closed my hand around the crystal and felt it pulse against my skin like a second heart, felt the weight of responsibility and grace combined, and understood that I was being trusted with something infinitely precious, not because I was special or qualified, but because I had somehow retained enough of that original frequency to recognize truth when it stood bleeding in front of me wearing The face of an alien who spoke about God with the reverence of someone who had seen his work across 1,000 worlds and found it beautiful every single time. I felt the crystal's pulse synchronize with my own heartbeat, and something about that rhythm gave me courage to ask the question that had been clawing at my throat since the hologram first appeared, the question that felt dangerous and necessary in equal measure. I asked him why governments would hide something so beautiful, why anyone would want to keep humanity from knowing they were loved and purposed and part of a cosmic family that stretched beyond our small blue world into the waiting arms of a creator who had gone to such extraordinary lengths to nurture consciousness into being. His eyes darkened with something that looked like grief mixed with anger, an expression so human despite his alien features that I felt the distance between us collapse entirely, and he told me that those in power had always known, had been contacted and shown the truth decades ago when the first scouts arrived to prepare the way for the awakening, but that knowledge threatened the very foundations upon which their authority rested, threatened the borders and hierarchies and systems of control that required humanity to feel small and separate and afraid. He said the truth about 3I/Atlas would prove that we were never meant to be divided by nation or race or religion, that the divine frequency existed equally in every human, regardless of the labels we'd invented to justify dominion over one another. And that revelation would make it impossible to sustain the lies that kept people compliant and convinced that scarcity and competition were the only laws that mattered in an abundant universe designed for cooperation and love. His breathing stuttered, and I reached for his wrist to check his pulse, but he caught my hand instead, holding it with surprising strength as he continued speaking with urgency that came from knowing his time was running out, telling me that the activation of 3I/Atlas would do more than just announce the presence of the architects. It would trigger a frequency shift that would affect human consciousness on a planetary scale, would make it exponentially harder for people to sustain hatred and deception, because the resonance from the arc would amplify the divine frequency already encoded in our DNA, would essentially turn up the volume on our capacity for empathy and truth recognition until the darkness that had hidden in positions of power could no longer maintain its camouflage against the light. I understood then why they would fight to keep this secret, why they would prefer humanity remain asleep and manageable rather than awaken to our true nature as spiritual beings having a temporary physical experience, why they would suppress evidence and silence witnesses and construct elaborate narratives to explain away anything that might hint at the larger reality waiting just beyond the veil of consensus perception. He told me there were good people within those institutions who wanted to tell the truth, but were bound by oaths and threats, and the genuine fear that humanity might panic if the revelation came without proper preparation, but that the architects had determined the time had come, regardless of whether earthly powers felt ready, that the spiritual evolution of our species had reached a tipping point where we either expanded into greater consciousness or risked destroying ourselves through the very separation thinking that the truth would dissolve. The weight of what he was telling me pressed against my chest like physical force, and I thought about my patients, about the farmers and teachers and factory workers who came to my clinic with ailments both physical and spiritual, with bodies that hurt from labor and hearts that ached from losses they had no framework to understand as temporary separations in an eternal story of souls learning to love across lifetimes and dimensions. And I wondered how they would react to learning that everything they'd been taught about their insignificance was a lie, that they mattered infinitely to a God who had literally seeded worlds and guided evolution across billions of years just to create the conditions where beings like them could emerge and eventually remember their divine origin. The alien seemed to sense my thoughts because he smiled despite his pain and told me that ordinary people would adapt far more quickly than the powerful expected, that humans had always known these truths at a level deeper than conscious thought, had encoded them in myths and mysticism, and the persistent sense that there was more to existence than what our five senses reported, that every religion had carried fragments of the real story, even when institutions corrupted the message, and that the awakening would feel less like learning something new and more like remembering something we'd forgotten but had been homesick for our entire lives. He said that was why they had chosen this moment in human development, when communication technology meant the truth could spread faster than suppression, when enough people had become disillusioned with the old systems to be open to radically different paradigms, when the combination of scientific advancement and spiritual hunger had created a space where faith and evidence could finally shake hands and recognize each other as complementary paths toward the same ultimate reality. Asked him what would happen to those who refused to accept the truth, even when 3i/Atlas made itself He placed his fingertips against my temples with a gentleness that seemed impossible given his deteriorating condition. And before I could ask what he intended, the world around me dissolved into cascading light that carried me backward through time with a velocity that should have terrified me, but instead felt like coming home after a lifetime of exile. I saw Earth as it had been millions of years before civilization, when our continents were arranged differently, and the air itself hummed with a frequency I could somehow hear, despite being shown only vision, a note so pure and resonant that I understood immediately it was the original sound spoken into existence by the architect of architects, the one we had always called God, but had never truly comprehended in his full creative magnitude. The landscape beneath me shifted and evolved as I moved through epochs with dreamlike fluidity, watching ice ages come and go like breaths, watching early life crawl from ancient oceans, carrying within their primitive cells the same divine spark that now animated my own consciousness. And I wept without knowing why, except that I was witnessing the patience of a creator who would nurture matter across incomprehensible stretches of time just to eventually produce beings capable of knowing they were loved. Then the vision focused, and I saw them clearly for the first time, the luminous beings descending from ships that looked like they were woven from solidified starlight, touching down in clearings where early humans had gathered, and the recognition in those primitive faces was not fear but remembering, as though some part of them had known this reunion was always meant to happen. These were the architect's ambassadors, and they moved among our ancestors with such tenderness that I understood immediately how they had been misinterpreted as gods in our mythologies, when they were actually more like older siblings sent to guide humanity through our spiritual infancy, teaching not through domination, but through demonstration of what love looked like when it had evolved beyond selfishness into service. I watched as these beings of light gathered small groups around fires that burned with colors I had never seen in waking life, and though I heard no audible words, I received the lessons they transmitted directly into human consciousness, sacred geometry that showed how the same patterns governed the spiral of galaxies and the chambered Nautilus shell, how everything from atom to solar system followed divine mathematics that proved intelligence and intention behind creation rather than random chaos producing accidental awareness. They taught our ancestors that their bodies were temporary vehicles for eternal consciousness, that death was no more final than sleep, that the separation they experienced from each other and from God was an illusion necessary for the experience of individual identity, but not the deepest truth of existence, which was unity expressed through temporary diversity. I saw one being in particular, taller than the others, with a radiance that seemed to contain all colors simultaneously, place his hands on the head of a human elder, and transmit something that made the old man's entire body illuminate from within. And I knew without being told that I was witnessing the first deliberate activation of what we would later call enlightenment or Christ consciousness, the awakening of a human being to their true nature as a child of the living God who had never actually been separate from their Creator except in the mistaken belief that physical form meant spiritual isolation. The elder opened his eyes, and I saw in them the same recognition I had glimpsed in the alien's gaze just moments ago in my clinic. The look of someone who had remembered something so fundamental that forgetting it seemed impossible, yet we had somehow built entire civilizations on that amnesia. These teachings spread slowly across the ancient world, passed from awakened ones to seeking students, encoded in symbols and stories that would survive the centuries, even when their full meaning became obscured by institutional interpretation and the human tendency to worship the messenger rather than embody the message. The vision accelerated forward through history, and I saw the pattern repeat across cultures and continents, avatars being born into human form, carrying higher frequencies of divine consciousness, each one attempting to remind their generation that the kingdom of God was not some distant heaven you reached after death by following the right rules, but a present reality you accessed by recognizing the sacred nature of existence itself and choosing to live from love rather than fear. I saw Jesus clearly. Then not as the pale figure from Sunday school paintings, but as a Middle Eastern man with calloused hands and laugh lines around his eyes, a man who was fully human and fully awake to his divine nature in a way that made him a demonstration of what we were all meant to become. Rather than an exception, we were meant to worship from a safe distance that excused us from attempting the same transformation. The alien's voice echoed through the vision, telling me that Jesus had been one of many such avatars sent by the architects across different worlds and times, each one calibrated to the specific cultural context where they incarnated, each one teaching the same essential truth in whatever language their people could receive, that God was not an angry judge demanding blood sacrifice, but a loving source that had diversified itself into countless expressions of consciousness so that it could experience relationship and growth and the particular joy that comes from choosing love when fear would be easier. I watched as Jesus taught in parables that encoded the same sacred geometry and cosmic law that the luminous beings had shared with our ancestors, watched him heal by raising people's frequency back into alignment with their divine blueprint, watched him die, not as payment for sin, but as demonstration that consciousness survives physical death and that love is quite literally stronger than the forces that seek to silence truth through violence. The vision showed me what happened after, how his message of radical unity and direct access to God threatened the religious and political powers who required intermediaries and hierarchies to maintain control, how the revolutionary truth that every human carried, Christ's potential, was gradually domesticated into a religion about Christ that made him special, precisely so we wouldn't attempt to follow him into the fullness of our own divinity. And I felt the alien's grief flowing through the images as he showed me centuries of beautiful truth being weaponized into justification for exactly the kind of separation thinking and conditional love that Jesus had challenged with every breath of his ministry. But the vision didn't end in despair. Instead, it spiraled upward to show me the present moment, showed me millions of humans across the planet waking up simultaneously to the deeper truths that institutions had obscured, showed me how the frequency of consciousness was rising despite the resistance of those who profited from keeping humanity asleep. And I understood that 3I/Atlas wasn't invading Earth, but returning to finish what had been started eons ago, when the first seeds of divine consciousness were planted in the soil of this world. When his fingers finally left my temples, I was back in the clinic, with tears streaming down my face and a certainty burning in my chest that felt like a star-going supernova, the absolute knowledge that I had been shown the true story of creation and redemption, that God was so much more loving and patient and creative than any theology had captured, and that the alien dying before me was himself an expression of that divine love, a being who had crossed impossible distances to ensure that one more human remembered who we really were before the Great Awakening arrived to remind us all. The crystalline tears still wet on my face caught the fluorescent light of my clinic as I struggled to find words for what I had witnessed. My medical training utterly inadequate to process visions of cosmic truth that had bypassed my intellect entirely and written themselves directly onto my soul. The alien's eyes had dimmed further during the transmission, his luminescence fading like a sunset that knows it will not see another dawn. Yet there remained in his gaze a fierce urgency that told me he had saved the most important revelation for this moment, when I was finally capable of receiving it without the filters of doctrine or dogma, reducing it to something manageable enough to file away and forget. He reached for my hand, with fingers that trembled now, his grip surprisingly warm, despite the obvious shutdown of his biological systems. And when he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate in my chest cavity as much as my ears, as though the words themselves were tuned to the frequency of truth that human language could only approximate but never fully capture. "You must understand about the avatars," he whispered, and I leaned closer because I knew with absolute certainty that whatever came next would change not just my understanding of religion, but my comprehension of reality itself. Jesus was never meant to be worshipped as separate from you. He came to show you what you are capable of becoming when you remember your true nature as children of the infinite Creator. The way he said it carried no blasphemy, no attempt to diminish the sacred, but rather an elevation of it beyond the boundaries where we had tried to contain divinity in creeds and denominations that made God small enough to fit inside our certainties, while keeping everyone else's experience of the divine safely categorized as heresy or delusion. He explained that the architects understood something fundamental about consciousness evolution, that beings learn best not through instruction manuals handed down from unreachable authorities, but through embodied examples who demonstrate transformation from within the same conditions and limitations that everyone else experiences, making the possibility tangible rather than theoretical. Jesus had been born fully human, with all the vulnerability and potential that entailed, but he had maintained conscious connection to his divine source, in a way that most humans forgot during the trauma of physical birth and the subsequent conditioning of societies built on separation thinking, and this remembering while in human form was precisely what made him a way-shower, rather than a savior who would do the spiritual work for us while we remained passive recipients of grace we never had to integrate into action. The alien's grip tightened as he shared that Jesus had known his true mission was not to establish a religion bearing his name, but to crack open the door of human consciousness so that light could flood into the darkness of our forgetting, to prove that matter and spirit were never opposed, but always unified, and that a human being fully awakened to their divine nature would naturally express the fruits of that awakening through radical love, miraculous healing, and a fearlessness that came from knowing that physical death could not touch the eternal essence of who they truly were. I found myself asking through tears how something so beautiful had become so distorted, how a message of universal divine potential had calcified into systems that taught humans they were fundamentally broken and separated from God by sin that only blood sacrifice could repair, and the alien's expression carried an ancient sorrow that seemed to encompass centuries of watching truth bent into tools of control. He showed me, without words, how it had happened, how those who encountered Jesus and experienced genuine transformation tried to share what they had learned, but the transmission lost fidelity. With each retelling as it passed through minds still operating from fear and scarcity consciousness, how the radical equality he taught where slaves and masters were equally beloved. Children of God threatened power structures that required hierarchy to function, how making him uniquely divine rather than demonstrating available divinity served those who needed intermediaries between humans and the sacred, because direct access would eliminate the leverage that priests and kings used to maintain authority over souls and bodies alike. The grief in his fading eyes was not for Jesus, who had completed his mission and returned to the larger consciousness from which he had temporarily focused, into human form, but for the billions of humans across millennia who had been taught to worship the pointing finger instead of looking where it pointed, who had been told that someone else's connection to God 2,000 years ago somehow made their own direct experience less valid or even dangerously heretical if it contradicted official interpretations written by councils with political agendas and theological axes to grind. But even as he shared this history of distortion, his voice lifted with something that transcended the tragedy, a note of hope that suggested the story was far from over and that everything had perhaps unfolded exactly as it needed to for humanity to learn the lessons that only confusion and suffering could teach about the consequences of forgetting our true nature. He told me that the architects had always known some corruption of the message was inevitable because humans learn through experience and mistake-making rather than through perfect obedience to external rules, and that even the distortion had served by creating such hunger in sincere seekers that when the truth finally emerged again, it would be recognized and cherished in ways it might not have been if it had never been lost in the first place. The awakening that 3I/Atlas would trigger was not bringing new information from outside, but rather activating dormant memory, already encoded in human DNA and soul-level consciousness, a remembering that would feel simultaneously like radical revelation and like coming home to something we had always known in the depths beyond where doctrine could reach. His breathing became more labored as he pressed the crystalline device into my palm and told me that it contained not commandments or prophecies, but rather a frequency transmission that would help people recognize the Christ consciousness already present within them, the same awareness that Jesus had embodied and invited everyone to discover through the scandalous suggestion that the things he did, we would do also, and even greater things, because he was showing us the path rather than walking it for us while we watched from the sidelines of our own spiritual evolution. The crystalline device pulsed against my palm with a warmth that seemed alive, rhythmic, like a heartbeat, synchronized to something vast and ancient beyond my capacity to name, and as the alien's fingers released their grip, I understood, with devastating clarity, that he was transferring far more than an object. He was passing a responsibility that would remake every remaining day of my life into something I could never have chosen, but somehow had always been prepared to carry. His luminescence had faded to barely a whisper of light beneath his translucent skin. The blue glow that had first arrested my attention, now reduced to intermittent flickers like stars struggling against the coming dawn. Yet his eyes held mine with an intensity that transcended the failing biology and spoke directly to the part of me that existed beyond credentials and skepticism. "You feel the weight of it," he said, though his lips barely moved, and I couldn't be certain whether I heard the words with my ears or received them through the same direct transmission that had flooded me with visions moments before. Not the physical weight, but the gravity of choice it represents, whether to trust that humanity is ready for what they have forgotten they already know. I wanted to protest that I was just a small-town doctor who set broken bones and prescribed antibiotics for infections, that choosing someone like me for world-altering responsibility was a cosmic miscalculation. But even as the thought formed, I recognized it as the last, desperate negotiation of an ego that preferred comfortable obscurity to the terrifying honor of being selected as a conduit for truth that billions needed to hear. The device seemed to grow warmer in response to my fear, not burning but soothing, and through its contact, I felt what I can only describe as assurance flowing into my nervous system like a medicine calibrated precisely to treat the specific illness of doubt that plagued my willingness to accept that ordinary people have always been God's preferred vessels, because our ordinariness makes the extraordinary work we're called to do undeniably sacred rather than merely impressive. He told me then about the timing that I would recognize when it arrived, how 3i/Atlas would announce itself in ways that even the most committed skeptics and most rigid fundamentalists would be unable to dismiss or explain away through the comfortable frameworks they had constructed to keep reality manageable and their worldviews unchallenged by evidence of divine complexity. The activation sequence had already begun, he explained, though what observatories were currently detecting as anomalous trajectory changes were actually the arc responding to threshold conditions in human collective consciousness. Enough souls had reached sufficient awareness through meditation and prayer and simple compassionate living that the frequency resonance had triggered protocols encoded billions of years ago by architects who understood that readiness for revelation could not be imposed from outside, but had to emerge organically from within the species being guided toward remembering. When the signal became undeniable in the coming months, governments would scramble to control the narrative. Scientists would argue about natural phenomena versus intelligent design. Religious authorities would debate whether it confirmed or contradicted their particular interpretation of Scripture. But none of their explanations would satisfy the deepening hunger in ordinary people who would instinctively recognize that something profound was shifting in the fabric of reality itself. That would be my moment, not to force the message on anyone or to proclaim myself as special, but simply to share what I had been given and trust that those who were ready would recognize the truth frequency, while those who needed more time would receive exactly the experiences necessary for their continued evolution without judgment or condemnation, because the architects worked on timescales that made human urgency look like the impatience of children who cannot yet understand that growth cannot be rushed without causing damage. The way he described it removed the burden of conversion or convincing that I had feared would crush me beneath expectations I could never fulfill, replacing it instead with the simple invitation to be transparent about my own experience and let others determine for themselves what resonated as truth in the sanctuary of their own direct relationship with the divine that needed no intermediary. He reminded me that Jesus himself had never demanded belief as a prerequisite for healing or inclusion, had never turned away those whose theology was incorrect or whose lifestyle violated religious codes, but had instead offered his presence and his compassion and trusted that experiencing unconditional love would transform people more effectively than any sermon about why they should change. The message encoded in the device followed the same principle. It was not information to be learned intellectually like studying for an examination where right answers earned admission to heaven, but rather a frequency that would activate remembering in those who encountered it, helping them recognize the Christ consciousness already present within them as their deepest identity beneath all the layers of conditioning and trauma and forgetfulness that made divine nature seem like blasphemous presumption rather than simple truth. I would not need to defend it or prove it or build an organization around it, he assured me, as his breath became shallow and labored, because truth that originates from the source that created galaxies and consciousness does not require human marketing strategies or institutional protection. It simply needs to be offered freely and then trusted to find its way to exactly who needs to receive it, exactly when they are capable of integrating it into their unique path of awakening. His final words came in whispers that I had to lean so close to hear that I felt his breath against my ear, warm and increasingly irregular as his biology surrendered to damage that even his advanced cellular technology could no longer repair, despite my desperate attempts to stabilize him with instruments designed for human physiology. "Tell them," he said with effort that cost him dearly, "that the architects are not separate from the God they already worship. They are the hands through which infinite creative love works across dimensions and galaxies, planting seeds of consciousness and tending gardens of souls across timescales that make your religions look like photographs, capturing single moments of an epic story that has no beginning and no ending." He pressed my hand more firmly around the device, and I felt it respond by conforming to my grip as though recognizing its new keeper through some technology indistinguishable from magic or miracle, depending on which vocabulary one preferred for describing the sacred. "Tell them that science and faith were never enemies, but always two languages describing the same ultimate reality, and that the division between them was a wound in human consciousness that 3i/Atlas will help heal by demonstrating that divine intelligence and cosmic evolution are the same creative force expressing itself through matter and spirit unified." His eyes locked onto mine with a final surge of clarity that felt like a gift he was giving himself through sheer force of will, determination to see his mission completed, even as death pulled him toward whatever transformation awaited beings like him beyond physical form. Most of all, tell them they are loved beyond measure. Not loved conditionally based on belief or behavior, but loved essentially because they are expressions of the same source that loved them into existence, and will love them through every stumbling step of the journey home to full remembering of who they have always been. The crystalline device sat in my desk drawer for 3 days, while I moved through my shifts in a fog of disbelief and hyper-awareness. Every patient interaction feeling simultaneously mundane and cosmically significant, as though I were seeing double. The ordinary world of blood pressure readings and prescription refills overlaid with shimmering suggestions of the greater reality the alien had opened within my perception, like a door I could never fully close again. I had buried him in the woods behind my property under moonlight, whispering prayers from my childhood faith that mingled with gratitude for his sacrifice, feeling no contradiction between the Jesus I had learned about in Sunday school and the cosmic architecture he had revealed, because somehow his explanation had made my faith larger rather than smaller, more magnificent rather than diminished. Then on the 4th morning I woke to my phone erupting with news alerts, every major observatory releasing simultaneous statements about anomalous readings from the interstellar object designated 3i/Atlas, and my hands trembled so violently I could barely swipe through the articles describing trajectory changes that defied known physics and signal patterns that refused to match any natural phenomenon scientists had catalogued. The language of their carefully worded statements tried desperately to maintain professional skepticism, while their data screamed what they could not yet allow themselves to believe. And I recognized in their academic caution the same resistance I had felt in my clinic before. Seeing luminous blue blood with my own eyes and having ancient visions downloaded directly into my consciousness by a dying messenger who had crossed impossible distances to find me. The device called to me from the drawer with a presence I could feel even from the kitchen, where I stood frozen, with coffee growing cold in my shaking hands. And when I finally retrieved it, the crystal had changed. Where before it had been clear like diamond, now it pulsed with subtle colors that shifted like aurora borealis contained within impossible geometry that seemed to have more dimensions than the 3-dimensional space it occupied. The moment my skin made contact, I felt the connection activate fully. For the first time, and what flooded into me was not merely information, but living understanding that bypassed intellectual processing and wrote itself directly into the substrate of my being, where knowledge and experience become indistinguishable from identity. I saw humanity from the perspective the architects held, billions of souls, at varying stages of remembering their divine nature, and the overwhelming emotion that accompanied this vision was not the judgment I had been conditioned to expect from religious teaching, but rather infinite patience and tender compassion for the difficulty of our journey. Embodied consciousness, forgetting its origin so completely that rediscovering it becomes the hero's journey that transforms spiritual infants into mature co-creators, capable of joining the great work across galaxies. I understood then what the alien had meant about Jesus being an avatar, not diminishing his divinity, but revealing that Christ consciousness was the achieved state of full remembering that he came to model and teach, demonstrating that the kingdom of God was not a distant destination requiring death to access, but rather the reality already present when we learn to perceive through eyes cleansed of the cataracts of separation and fear. The revelation that shook me most profoundly was seeing how perfectly Jesus' actual message aligned with what the architects had encoded in 3i/Atlas. Both were invitations to remember our essential nature as beloved children of the infinite creative source. Both taught that love was not merely an emotion, but the fundamental force that held atoms together and spun galaxies into being, and connected every consciousness across all dimensions in a web of relationship that made isolation a tragic illusion. The distortions that had fragmented Christianity into competing theologies obsessed with correct doctrine and exclusive salvation were shown to me as understandable but heartbreaking misunderstandings, like children arguing about which of them their mother loves most when she holds infinite love for each according to their unique needs and capacities. I wept holding the device as I comprehended that nothing the alien revealed contradicted the deepest truth of my faith, that God is love, and we are made in that image, but rather expanded it beyond tribal boundaries and planetary limitations into a cosmos where billions of worlds hosted billions of expressions of the same divine experiment in consciousness, evolving toward unity while maintaining the individuality that made love possible rather than coerced. The architects were not replacing God, but revealing how infinite creative intelligence worked through hierarchies of being and scales of time that made angels and aliens potentially different names for the same intermediate expressions of divine will, messengers and gardeners and teachers serving the same source that humans access through prayer and meditation and simple acts of compassion that aligned finite will with infinite love. When I finally looked up from the device, the sun had shifted position and hours had passed in what felt like minutes, and I walked outside into my yard, where ordinary grass and common birds suddenly appeared sacred and intentional. Every element of creation revealed as a note in a symphony of such complexity and beauty that my previous understanding of reality seemed like a child's conception of music as nothing more than random noise. I stood there under a sky that now contained a secret, moving through space toward revelation, carrying verification of everything the dying scout had entrusted to me, and the terror I expected to feel about the responsibility was absent, replaced by a calm certainty that I was not alone in this, that the same intelligence that had guided me to be in the right place at the right time, to receive this gift, would guide me to know the right moment and the right method to release it. The device pulsed in my pocket against my chest like a second heart synchronized to rhythms older than Earth, and I understood that I did not carry the burden of humanity's awakening on my individual shoulders, but was simply one cell in the vast body of consciousness that included every person who had ever looked at stars and sensed they were not random accidents, but purposeful expressions of an intelligence that knew itself through the act of creating beings capable of wondering about their origins. Soon, the world would demand explanations. for what 3i/Atlas was revealing, and when the chaos of competing narratives reached its peak, I would offer what I had been given, not as someone special or superior, but as a simple witness to the truth that we are more loved and more significant and more cosmically connected than our philosophies had yet allowed us to believe. Children of the same God, who had simply forgotten we belonged to a family that spanned galaxies and dimensions and timescales beyond measurement, all of us making the long journey home to full remembering. The night I decided to release the message arrived not with dramatic signs, but with quiet certainty, like the moment you know dawn is coming. Even before light touches the horizon, a shift in the quality of darkness that speaks to senses deeper than vision. I had been watching the news coverage of 3i/Atlas intensify over weeks as governments issued contradictory statements and scientific institutions published data they could not reconcile with existing models, while social media erupted with theories ranging from elaborate hoaxes to apocalyptic warnings that fed fear rather than wonder. The device had become an extension of my awareness during this time, its presence teaching me patience as I learned to distinguish between the ego's anxious urgency to be significant and the soul's patient knowing that divine timing operates according to rhythms more ancient and reliable than human anxiety. Then one evening, as I sat with an elderly patient holding her hand while she wept about feeling her life had meant nothing, I felt the device pulse 3 times against my heart, and I knew with cellular certainty that the moment had arrived, that the fear and chaos had ripened into collective readiness, even if that readiness looked like desperation. Because sometimes we only open to grace when our smaller stories collapse and leave space for larger truth to enter. I drove to the highest point in our county that night, a lookout where teenagers went to kiss and dreamers went to think, and I brought nothing but the device and a simple video camera, because I understood the message needed a human face and a human voice rather than anonymous digital distribution that could be dismissed as clever manipulation. The stars overhead included the location where 3i/Atlas moved through space on its impossible trajectory, and I stood under that specific point of light, feeling the connection between the cosmic and the intimate, between the incomprehensible distances involved, and the fact that all of it had led to this moment of a small-town doctor preparing to speak truth that would sound like madness to some and liberation to others. When I activated the device fully for the first time, it rose from my palm and hovered at eye level, projecting around me a sphere of soft golden light that felt like being held in the gentlest possible embrace. And I began to speak, not from notes or preparation, but from the overflow of everything I had been given, trusting that the right words would come because they were not ultimately mine, but belonged to the current of divine communication that had flowed through prophets and poets and ordinary people touched by grace throughout human history. I explained what I had witnessed and what had been revealed to me, and as I spoke about the architects and the ancient seeding and the true message of Jesus as a demonstration of our potential rather than an unreachable exception, I felt no anxiety about whether I would be believed, because I understood that truth operates like seeds scattered broadly, taking root where the soil has been prepared by each soul's unique journey toward readiness. The most important part of the message came not from my words, but directly from the device itself, which projected holographic images that showed Earth from space, surrounded by presences of light that had been witnessing and guiding human development across millennia, never controlling, but always offering invitation toward greater love and deeper understanding of our unity with all consciousness. I watched my own camera screen fill with imagery that no special effects team could fabricate. Sacred geometry rotating through dimensions, while a soundless music seemed to emanate from the projections themselves. And I knew that whatever analysis skeptics performed on this recording, they would find no evidence of manipulation, because what was being documented was genuinely happening in physical, space through technology that made our most advanced instruments look like stone tools. Then the device spoke in a voice that was somehow every language simultaneously, words that each listener would hear in their own tongue, and it delivered the message. The dying scout had crossed the void to plant on Earth, like a seed timed to sprout at this exact moment of human history. The essence was simple enough that a child could grasp it, yet profound enough that mystics could contemplate it for lifetimes. You are not accidents in an indifferent universe, but beloved children of the infinite Creator, experiments in embodied divinity, learning through joy and suffering to choose love freely rather than automatically, and your awakening into full remembrance of your nature has always been not a question of if but when, with this moment representing a threshold where enough souls have matured sufficiently that collective transformation becomes possible rather than overwhelming. I stood in that sphere of golden light as the message concluded, with an invitation rather than a command, the device explaining that 3i/Atlas would fully activate when humanity demonstrated readiness not through perfection, but through collective intention toward unity and compassion, when enough hearts turned from fear and separation toward love and connection that the frequency shift became self-sustaining, like a fire reaching the point where it generates its own heat. As the projection faded and the device returned to my palm, now quiet and dark, as though it had given everything it contained, I felt not emptiness, but fullness, not the ending of something, but the beginning. And I understood that my role was complete, while humanity's next chapter was just opening. I uploaded the video to every platform I could access, and then I drove home through pre-dawn darkness. And by the time the sun rose, my phone had exploded with messages I did not need to read, because the outcome was no longer my responsibility. The seed was planted and would grow according to laws more powerful than algorithms or institutional resistance. I made coffee in my kitchen as light filled my windows, and I thanked God, not as a distant judge, but as the intimate presence I now recognized in every breath and heartbeat. Thanked Jesus for showing us the pattern of divine humanity fully realized, and thanked the dying alien whose sacrifice had midwifed my own rebirth into understanding that was simultaneously ancient and radically new. Whatever happened next, I knew I would face it not with fear, but with the unshakable peace that comes from finally understanding that we are held in love beyond measure, that our fumbling attempts at consciousness and compassion are cherished by an intelligence that counts every sparrow's fall, and numbers every hair, and knows each soul by name across all the countless worlds, where the great adventure of spirit learning itself through matter unfolds in variations as infinite as creativity itself. Could you walk outside right now and see the stars differently, knowing you might be part of something far more magnificent than you were taught to believe? Subscribe to continue this journey of awakening together.